and a real problem. Diversity truly is a code word for. I think there's another point to be made there too, though, about diversity. Everybody says, well, not everybody. The left in particular says diversity is our strength, and I think they're right, though. I don't think they're even lying. They say diversity is our strength, and they're being honest. It is their strength, right? They profit off of it, but we don't. And look at where, man, this is a red pill. If you look at where like refugees and illegal immigrants are going, where are they going? They're going to predominantly white areas. They're displacing the whites there. They're diluting the voter pool significantly. And that's a benefit to the Democratic Party. The parties don't represent either side of the political spectrum anymore. They're very much the same side of the coin anymore. The only sort of alternative position is sort of centrism, and even then, where are you going to vote, right? Are you going to vote the Green Party? The Green Party is ultra liberal. You're not going to vote the Green Party. And it's so stunning to me. The illegal immigrants, the refugees, aren't going to New York or California or, even southern Texas, right? They're going north. They're going to the Midwest. They're diluting the white vote significantly. And, it's no doubt in my mind by design.
Well, yeah, you discussed that part of it, right? And what really bothers me, as someone that lives in the Mid-Atlantic, is I have to deal with fleeing people from New England who have failed their states and created failed states and are now fleeing, right? They can't stand to live where they've created this disaster. They can't admit that they've done wrong, but they know they can't stay where they're at. So they come to Maryland, they go to Pennsylvania, they go to Virginia, they go to North Carolina, they go to West Virginia, they go to Ohio, and they think, all right, cool. I can go somewhere now and I can have safe roads. I can have good roads. I can have a safe neighborhood. I can get away from this urban sprawl. But then they set out to recreate exactly what they fled. They use the same policies. They get into our governments because, and here's the real problem, right? Look at Michigan, look at Minnesota, look at Virginia, West Virginia, Pennsylvania. A hallmark of those states is that, well, the people in general are like, you know what? As long as the government doesn't interfere too much in my life, I don't really care. I don't give a shit. Right? I don't care what happens. I just want to be left alone to determine my life for myself. Right? But these people, these leftists, they can't live like that. So they come down and they say, that statue is racist. Right? Like that university name, that man was not good. He was an anti-Semite. Henry Ford was a Nazi. And so we redefine these things. And this is really a problem that I have with where we're going. And honestly, I'll be completely honest with you. My biggest problem with leftists on an institutional and fundamental level is that they want to redefine what meaning is. Right? They don't want wood to be wood. They want it to be metal. They don't want metal to be metal. They want it to be glass. They can't argue on a fair ground, right? Like they can't. They know they'll lose. They know that what they're saying is wrong, and that people won't buy it if they say it openly. So they don't. They hide it. They disguise it. They call white identity racism. They call Western culture bigoted. They call it racist. They call it inferior. They call it whitewash. They say that the good tenets, the things that everyone agrees on, are wrong. That they're not white. They're not Western. They're African. They're Middle Eastern. They're Judaic. They're anything other than inherently Western civilization. Right? They're redefining history, not based on fact, but based on what they want us to believe. That's the hardest thing for me, because I'm a very logical person personally, and I strive for objective truth, whether or not it benefits me. And to see this gaining traction, to see this becoming mainstream, I think that's the hard part, I think, for a lot of people my generation. You know, I'm what they call an echo boomer, right? Like I'm in my mid 30s. I was the last generation to be raised without being immersed, quote unquote, in technology. I mean, we had televisions, obviously, and radios. It's kind of silly to say that, but you know, my generation, by and large, we remember what things were like before the change, and I really grieve for those that'll never know what that's like, or that won't know what that's like for generations to come. And I think that as a group, we have to really look back at why did the baby boomers, why did the Generation X, why did they deny us a life that they were able to live, right? Like through their own greed, through their own self-interest, they denied their children a life that they themselves got to live. They got to live in a majority white America. And when I say majority white, I mean vast majority white. And they denied that same truth, that same life to the children. And that's so hard for me to really come to terms with. I really, you know, even though I'm 34 now, about to be 35, like, I just don't get it.
So I feel truly blessed. I was born in late 1989, and I lived in a very, very, very interesting time growing up in the Midwest, because here in the Midwest, I feel like things are a little bit slower to kind of get to you, you know, because of the conservative leanings of the people. And what ended up happening is I grew up in a place, in a time, where I had the last sort of vestiges of the old ways, right? Let's just call it that. The old ways. It was safe for me to go out and ride a bike all day, you know? Just ride a bike all day. It didn't matter. My parents are like, hey, yeah, go ahead, you know? We live in a majority white little town, and it's safe. Nobody's gonna hurt you. Just be back, be back for dinner. And time has gone on, and oh my God, people dare not let their child out for that long. Trick-or-treating, right? It's October 29th, trick-or-treating's right around the corner. I remember when I was, around 8, and my parents are like, okay, go ahead, go trick-or-treating. We'll be, behind you a considerable distance, but you go ahead and do your thing. If they win at all, that's the thing. When I was like 10, it was still, oh yeah, go ahead, You do you. We'll see you when you get back with all your candy, and we'll. The only thing that people were concerned about with this was this meme of razor blades in the chocolate. Do you remember that? I mean, this was the thing. It was so safe. It was so cozy. And I mean, God, this is the thing. I feel like everybody says, well, Gen Z is so based. They're so conservative. But they don't even know. They don't even know what it was like growing up in the 90s, where everything was just so comfortable and safe. And, like I was just saying, the wife and I went to the store. The dumbest things now are locked up. And what has changed? What has changed in those mere 18 years since I was 10, when nothing was locked up, right? What has changed? The only thing that has changed, really, has been the demographics of the country. And yet so much of our culture and of our way of life has changed as a result of that one change that I can't anymore justify being on board with supporting it. And it horrifies me to think, we have a child on the way. It horrifies me to think what kind of life that child is going to lead and what kind of life they're going to live because of the altruism gone awry of the boomer generation who is now in power.
You hit it right on the head for me, right? Like the nail head has been squashed. I think we're probably expecting, funny enough, like right around the same time. My wife and I were expecting a child. Um, it's our third, and you know, I see the struggle that we have, not necessarily to provide for the two that we have now, but you know, my wife and I both must work to make sure, because we have very different skill sets, to provide the life that we expect to be able to live, right? Like it's not affluent, right? It's middle class. And it's funny, in talking with my mother, who is an early boomer, rather. She was born in 52. You know, she effectively was able to make the same, when you know, adjust for inflation, amount of money that my wife and I together make. And I'm in management, and my wife is in a white collar position, right? We're not blue collar laborers. We're not, retail employees, right? Like, I have someone who has sought after skills. So does she. We're not easily replaceable. Can we be replaced? Sure. But it's not as if you can grab anyone off the street to do the jobs that we do. And yet, I still make half what my unskilled mother made 30 years ago. That's mind numbing to me. And you're going to argue, and when I say you, I mean your compassionate conservatives, your neoliberal economics conservatives, right? Or liberals in that case. You're going to argue that we still need immigration, that we need demographic bolstering. How does that benefit us at all? I joke a lot. My wife and I, we're very blessed, right? We live on a street that is sort of an island, right? Like, we live in a world that doesn't exist anymore. Like you referenced, we let our girls run down the street, right? We have families like us on the same street, and One group has 4, one group has 2, one has 1 is having 2 now, one has 2 now across the street. And we can let our kids go out. But we have to watch the traffic that goes down the street. And we're not long. It's maybe, 5, 6 houses, 7 houses long on each side. But, a street down, a street up, it's a completely different world. That's nuts. But we live it on an island, right? Like, we've shut our street down before, but we are the exception. And that's really what bothers me, is that we don't understand that we are the exception, that these lives that we live, they're not standard anymore, and they used to be. Hell, they used to be accessible to anyone. If they just worked, if they just put forth the effort. But we've lost that, right? As you said, one of the things my dad, he's always really, I asked him about some of these things I see on the Huffington Post or Vice or hell, even Salon. I say, can you imagine? Did you ever think when you were a young man or a man in your 20s or 30s that you'd ever see an article like this published? And he just says, no, I really didn't. I never thought in the entire course of my life that we'd get here. And I think that's really telling, I think that the empathy and the altruism has been preyed on. And I think we really need to start questioning why and who did that. How did we get to this point? How did we get to a point where it's acceptable for the absolute, just disgusting hedonistic ideals are propagated and protected by free speech, but you can't say that, hey, you know what? Maybe that group shouldn't have that special protection. That maybe protecting the domestic group, the nationalistic idea, that's terrible. To even be a nationalist now, think about that. To be proud of being American, to be ashamed of being patriotic, it's madness.
It's crazy. If I had just gotten like $10 off every time I've been called a Nazi in just the comment section of my super duper small YouTube channel, right? I have 29 subscribers as of today and a grand total of 400 views. The vast majority of views are on one video that people, I've looked at the analytics today, that people arrived at by looking for some other video entirely, right? If I had just $10, I'd have like $50, man. I mean, here's the thing. I'm not a Nazi, right? What I am is somebody who I grew up at a very, very blessed time. And you and I both probably lived very similar lifestyles. Here's the thing. I came after the boomers and like their generation and before Gen X, right? Like Gen X ideals don't jive with me in the slightest. And neither do the boomers. I exist in this weird, much in the same way as you do. This weird in between, this weird limbo. My parents, I distinctly remember I hit 18, and my parents said, well, why can't you get a job? And I'm like, don't you understand? I've only put in 30 applications in the last week. There are no jobs. Don't you understand? And they're like, no, I don't understand. When I was your age, there were jobs aplenty. And there were. Not only were there jobs aplenty, but they were damn good paying jobs. And one of the most interesting experiences in my life I don't want to give off the impression that I've lived in only white areas. I lived for a year and a half in a predominantly black neighborhood, and this is the thing. So I lived in that neighborhood. I mean, crime-ridden neighborhood. I was like literally one of the only white people in the neighborhood. It was pretty crazy. The first week, my car, the door handle got broken because somebody was trying to break into my vehicle. Literally, I hadn't even been there for 2 nights, and the car handle had been broken because somebody was trying to break into it. And so I lived there. And, a year and a half, that's plenty of time to acclimate and get used to sort of the way things go. You get used to the traffic, there's an ebb and flow to the traffic, when people are going to work, when the school buses are showing up, when the ice cream man comes, all this stuff. And then we moved. I was seeing a girl at the time. The relationship didn't work out for a number of reasons, the least of which not being she was insane. And we moved into an area that used to be like sort of really, really, really low class whites, and it was, infested with crime and so on. But literally, the first night there, she went off to work and I just happened to have the day off. And it was the most incredible thing, because for like a year and a half, there was one sound that I had never heard in that entire year and a half. And I heard it that night. And it was children playing. And it was so weird. I distinctly remember I went out with my gun on my hip because it sounded horrifying to me. It sounded like children screaming. And I went out to the backyard, and it was a bunch of kids playing ball and throwing frisbees and stuff. I was like, holy shit. This is the difference. There are places that this still happens. Do you know what I mean? How weird is that?
Well, yeah, that's I for you, I think being brought up in the Midwest was a blessing, but for me, it was being brought up on the East Coast in a rural area, right? Like it's a different world. Like I grew up on. I'm a little embarrassed, I guess, to say this in a way, but I grew up on a dirt road. It wasn't even paved. It was just gravel. It wasn't paved until, and then it was macadamized. It was years after I was alive before that thing was paved. That's the life that I knew, and I wasn't ashamed of it. And me and my neighbors, we were all white, and we would go out and play. And it's funny, my parents were like, "Ah, don't play with those kids. There's something wrong with those kids," And it was, later on, I find out, it was because the mother had had multiple marriages, and all of their kids were by different marriages, and that was really hard for me to understand. But that shaped my view of myself, and I thought to myself, that's not what I want. I want one wife, preferably if I can at all help achieve it, and I want to have a large family. Like that's what's important to me. I want to have 5, 6, 7 kids because that's what my grandfather had. I want that. I want a closeness to my children because I love them, you know? Not because not because of anything sinister, but because gosh, that's what life's about. Is caring about something that you create. And my wife and I, we often tell my daughter, my one that's old enough to actually understand, we say, you are born out of our love for us, right? Like you are an expression of mommy and daddy's love. And when we tell her that, like you can see it click with her. You can see her smile, and she thinks, "Man, that's amazing." That I am I am love. And that's what we've lost. And I think that's something that I think it's hard to say, but like between the so-called sexual revolution, between the dominance of black culture in America, between the sort of no fault divorce, this idea that, you know what, if you don't believe it or you don't like it, then get rid of it. This disposable society, we have lost what makes us, what makes us great, what makes us special. This willingness to persevere, to go through the pain. We've lost that. And my wife and I, we've had difficult times, but you know what? Gosh, I love her. I mean, I hate her at times. She's ridiculous and nuts and just says the craziest things and does the worst things. But she sticks by me and I stick by her. And you know what? I've been through like and you probably can share similar stories. You know, I've gotten close to closing the deal, getting married multiple times. And one time it was just wasn't meant to be, and one time I was like, "Oh my god, this lady's crazy. I gotta get out." And then finally this happened, and I was like, "You know what? This is what it's about. I'm gonna work really hard, and I'm gonna build a life for myself. This is what I've always aspired to." Most of my friends, you know, not to be condescending and not to be um, egotistical or just any sort of haughtiness, right? Like I was a really intelligent guy, right? Like I was naturally talented. I could pick up things really quickly. And my aptitude is off the fucking charts. But career wasn't important to me. Like recognition by my peers wasn't that important to me. All I ever wanted was a family. Like that was supreme to me. And I'd sacrifice anything for that. And I think unfortunately we've gotten to a state where our society says that really the best thing is to be selfish, to be indulgent, to be decadent, to give yourself all the things that you think that you need. But what we don't realize or recognize is that in 20 years, the things that you really want when you're 40 or 50, especially if you're a woman, they're gone. It's too late. You know, we have expiration dates. We are mortal. Our lives will end. And if we don't think about that and live like that when we're young, then there will be no future for us.
There won't be. I feel like, I'm a few beers deep, full disclosure, and it's on an empty stomach, no less. But I feel like, we're kind of two, in limbo boomers lamenting the what once was. And I guess maybe the world needs more of that, because I think, if it's not for conversations like these, that people forget that it existed, right? I too grew up on a dirt road, in a trailer park, for God's sake. My family was not wealthy, right? My family was, oh my God, not wealthy. They still aren't wealthy. Everything I have, I earned, right? And this, you listen to the conservatives, so-called conservatives, talk in government, and they're still so progressive. My God, I'm not asking for much. I'm not a Nazi. I'm not some hateful bigot. But by God, I just want to go back to what I distinctly remember. This isn't rose-colored goggles. It's not. I distinctly remember it. My wife remembers it. it's not too much to ask to say, like, guys, you know, that's what led me down this path in the first place. Was I said, holy cow, things have really changed. Where did all this come from? You know, my initial awakening was how hard it was to find a job at the age of 18, and how when I was 18, somebody with a master's degree was working a minimum wage job right next to me. I said, well, how did that happen? Oh, okay, the economy is in the toilet. How did that happen? Okay, oh well, geez, okay, great. We're importing more and more immigrants and reducing the overall, uh, you know, the average wage for the unskilled laborers. Okay, well, great. Where did that come from? Oh my God. Okay, it came from, A, B, or C reason. And man, just things have changed, and you and I think, are a unique breed because we grew up. We wouldn't have gone to school together. We wouldn't have gone to high school together, but just about. So I think we grew up in a very similar time, and evidently very similar sort of upbringings. And if it's not for people like us saying these things existed, they were good, and we need to conserve that. And I hate the word conserve. I really hate it, because if you look at conservatives, they've failed to conserve literally anything at all. But we need to conserve that. That isn't too much. And to acknowledge that there are a people, who don't share those values, that's a problem. And it's not hateful. It's not bigoted. It's not wrong. I think maybe that's the number one thing, for anybody listening who has cared to listen for this long. This is the number one thing. Everything that I talk about, and presumably you too, Western, everything that I talk about is born strictly from a position of love. Strictly. I don't hate anybody. Well, that's not true. I hate some people. But for completely valid reasons, not based on, their religion or their race or anything like that. I hate them for completely valid reasons, like they're despicable human beings, they're rapists, or they're, liars or whatever else. I hate them for completely valid reasons. I just, I love what I remember life being like, and what through my 28 years on this earth I have learned that life used to be like even before I was born. I love that, and I don't think it's wrong to want that, not just for me, but for my children, and for their children, and for their children, and so on. I don't understand how anybody can see that as a position not worth holding, or a position that is hateful or wrong.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I mean, you know, to me, it's like this idea of wonder, right? And I think it's why we are so nostalgic, right? Like, here's a good example. I hate to use video games as an analogy, but look at Fallout 4, look at Fallout 3, look at Skyrim. Why do you think those games were so big? It connects people to a self that they will never get, or that a reality with like Fallout that they can't feel like they can create in this world. Imagine, right? Think about it. Think about what it was like to be in a school in the 80s. You know, I loved my school, like I got to live a life where, gosh, we would just go out and play in the summer until our moms would go out there and yell for us, right? Like, we'd be out in the woods all night and just they'd scream and say, "Hey, come back, come back, come back. It's time to come home. Get your butts home before you get whipped." And you know, and then we come home and we get to play Nintendo or Atari or whatever you had. And that was a great life. You know, I recently asked my daughter, I was like, do you guys get to play with the parachute in psychomotor? And she's like, what's psychomotor? And it's like, oh, wait, is it PE? What's PE? Okay, movement. That's movement now. But nothing changed, so why did we change the word? What did it have to change? Well, are we changing it so we lose that connection to our children? Makes me really wonder. Are we creating these divides between us arbitrarily? I'm not creating it, right? But is someone? And then why? It's one of those things. You're right. You're dead on right. It's not about hatred. It never has been. But I lived a great life when I was a kid, and I'd like others to be able to live that life. And the best way for me to ensure that is to have my own children and to work towards ensuring that through my local government, through my state government, that can happen. I'm a part of the PTO. I'm a part of, um, I'm a citizen. I'm a voter. Like, I do those things. And I think we really need to make sure that no matter what you believe, no matter how far gone you think things are, don't just give up. Our ancestors set about to create a structure that we could govern ourselves with, and they weren't stupid. In a lot of ways, they're a lot smarter than we have been. Um, so don't write those things off. We weren't stupid. We made very smart decisions in the past, and we still can today. So don't just dismiss something because it came from a previous generation. Don't think because it's old it's bad. Don't think because it isn't current that it isn't valuable. I mean, that's one of the big things that I think we really need to think about. Because we tend to be du jour about things, right? And not about whether or not there's inherent value in it. Um, you know, one big thing for me is that, again, not to harp on language, but generation to generation, we've lost so much, right? Like, look at our lingo, look at our colloquial English in America. Like, we've gotten so stupid. And I mean that in the nicest possible way. We just don't understand anything anymore. When you have to have things explained to you, it isn't because the things are necessarily wrong or bad. It's just that, you've lost a part of your history. And, I think that we should strive more towards this ideal of conservation in terms of, and you were very right. Our conservatives don't conserve a thing because realistically, as a people, we are very conservative, right? Like, if you look at specifically the wasps, right? Like, the Europeans, they're very conservative. They lived in a world where they might have a very short growing season, yet they survived. They thrived. You know, they were able to manage forestry and husbandry well before most people had that idea. And if you look at North America, if you look at the people that camp, that enjoy nature, well, it's predominantly us. We value it. We value it because it connects us to our roots as a people. And we can live in a modern world and live in that world at the same time. And I think for some people, that's just too hard to really accomplish. They can't they can't make a distinction between, okay, I am sacrificing my time, my desires for the good of my family, for the good of my people, and, well, I just want this for myself now. I want to indulge. And I think, well, I know that we really need to have that conversation.
We do. And in many ways, I get called so often by the far right. I get called a counter-signaling cuck, a purity spiraler, and all these other things. But I think it's time that we start saying, like, what is really important to us? Is it the destruction of the government? Is it just, is it just a return to the childhood that we all remember? What is important to us? And this ties back very much into the very first thing we talked about. What are your convictions? What means something to you? What is important? To me, I think the number one thing for me is what it has always been, and that is safety and security, right? It's not even so much liberty as such, this idea, this freedom, this individualistic freedom. It's just safety, because there is a coziness that comes with safety. It's why I own guns, I own 3. A rifle, a handgun, and a shotgun. That's what I think everybody should own. And there's a safety that comes with it. There's an idea. It's so powerful. This idea, like, just being able to walk out your front door and be like, I don't have anything to worry about, right? There's certain, crime you can't prevent, right? The random, outlier white, pedo, right? Of course you can't prevent that. You can't prevent all crime. Of course you can't. But there is just a real comfort in feeling safe. And I feel like even pre 9/11, there's a realization. I wonder if that was kind of when things started changing. I would have been 11 then. Well, almost 11. I would have been a month away from 11. I wonder if that's when things started changing. Just, there was such a different idea for what made up a community and what was important to a community. We started giving up things like these ideas of, because everything's interconnected, right? They're not discontinuous. They're all connected. We gave up things like the freedom from, being spied on by the government, right? On warrantless wiretaps and things like that. We're like, yeah, well, that's maybe not so important because, we gotta watch out for them terrorists. Well, why? Where I grew up, there were no terrorists. The worst crime somebody committed was, maybe DUI or, I don't know, growing some dope across the street or something. I mean, petty, tiny, minuscule, meaningless crime. We didn't have to worry about our planes being hijacked. Well, we do now. It's so pervasive that we live in a culture of fear. And I think maybe that's why everybody always says, well, you're a racist, you're a xenophobe, you're a transphobe, a homophobe, an Islamophobe. Maybe it's because there is such a culture of fear that's so pervasive through every aspect of our culture that the only way that people can interpret any opinion is indeed through the lens of fear, as opposed to that lens of love, right? Especially the young folks. The people who are just now entering adulthood, they're 10 years behind me now. A decade. Half a generation, if you want to go by that metric. The only way they know it is fear. Because they don't have it. They don't have the memory of love. Think 10 years ago. What happened 10 years ago? It was 2007. 6 years after 9/11. All they know is fear. They don't have a memory of what growing up in the 90s was like. All they remember is the pervasive fear that existed after 9/11. So maybe that's why all this is happening in the way it is because nobody seems to remember. These young people don't remember life pre 9/11.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that there's definitely this push to frame America in pre and post 9/11, in ante and post 9/11. For me, the reality is that 9/11 didn't mean a lot, right? Like I was aware, I was educated on what was happening in Europe at the time. And I've never really made a distinction between Europe and America. I've always seen America as an extension of Europe, as an extension of the United Kingdom. To me, and I've said this a lot, the United States is the continental realization of the United Kingdom. I truly believe that. Um, we have to do better about recognizing what it means to be American and who determined what America is. I got into so many arguments, and I continue to get in so many arguments about whether being American is something that you inherit or something that you can become. And I think that you're definitely right. Earlier you stated you can't just become American. You either are American, and to be American, that means to be British or to be German or Polish. To be someone who is of European descent or has lived in the United States or America for such a period that you've abandoned any pretense of other culture and that you ultimately determine that English is your language and all of its cultural institutions are your culture, right? Like that there's nothing wrong with being white, that realistically and ultimately to be an American is to be culturally white. That is beneficial for you despite your ethnicity, despite your culture, right? Despite the people that you are derived from. Because it doesn't matter what you are in terms of skin color. It matters more about whether or not you can live in a self-deterministic society. And if you can't, then I'm sorry, right? Like if you can't sacrifice not for yourself but for your successors, the continuation of your people, then this just isn't a place for you. Western society is not for you. And it doesn't mean that Western society is wrong. Maybe it means that, you know, your society is wrong, that your inclination is wrong. And I think unfortunately, right now, we're not winning the argument. I think that's starting to change, right? But I think the real problem is that people believe that you can just adopt these ideals, and I think it's demonstrably true that you can't. You have to be born into it. And it's not negative, it's not wrong, it just is. You have to believe in working hard. You have to believe in the idea that, you know what? If you want it, get it. And if you can't get it, then you didn't earn it. And if you didn't earn it, then work harder. you know? Like, look into yourself, look introspectively before you start blaming others. And I think that's unfortunately where we're at, is that we're not doing that anymore. And I think that that's a product of demographic shift, a weakening of our identity. And again, like you said, it's not about hate, it's just about, man, I love what we have. And I don't want that to go away just because we have some really decadent people and some elements in our society that want to see our downfall. I think that that's, to use a Dylan Thomas poem, I do not want to go gentle into that good night.
You know, I don't have an answer for it, but so often I think, Harvard with the segregated graduation ceremonies and all these liberals calling for segregation and all this, and I say, man, is that such a bad thing? Look at the black family before the civil rights movement. Overwhelmingly, the black family unit, in fact, the black family unit was stronger than white family units. The belief in the black community of the importance of the nuclear family was stronger than white folks, right? Than white people. Oh my God. Then post-civil rights, 92%. 92%. Like, you want to talk about, statistical insignificance. 92% of mixed race parents separate. 92%. It no longer, like, pre-civil rights, blacks were better off. Whites were better off. Mexicans, in the tiny portion that they existed pre-civil rights, everybody was better off across the board. And they say, no, you're just rose-colored glasses. That's not the case. No, it actually is the case, and it's empirically demonstrable. Holy crap. People, like, I'm not talking about some radical change back to 1940s America. I'm just saying, like, a rollback of culture here, a mere, 30, 40 years, is not the end of the world, and we actually need to examine, like, maybe this is worthwhile.
Yeah, so what's great about that is that we never really addressed that. We've never really looked back at civil rights and the women's liberation movement and seen whether or not it had a net positive impact on the family in America. And it seems like we've really lost the value in the family in America, even though no one wants to be alone, right? We all seek out friendships, we all seek out family, we all seek out a loved one. We want to go on. That is our biological imperative, right? Why can't we just admit it? We have to admit it. We have to come to terms with, we want children. We want to be, for lack of a better word, immortal. We want to live past ourselves. We want children. We want these things. And you're right. Like I said earlier, or in another conversation, the black family and the black family in America and the black individual in America did far better 50, 60 years ago than they do now. And somehow we got to a point where black culture became the dominant culture in the United States. And it wasn't the best aspects of black culture, it was the worst, right? It was this misogynistic. It was this, and I hate to use that term, but it was this really base born sort of I'm what's important. I'm never wrong. You did this to me sort of mentality. And you have to be willing to look at yourself and know that you've done a terrible thing or done a wrong thing and be held accountable to it. And I think that unfortunately, this cultural Marxist, this sort of communist or socialistic ideal that has started to hit mainstream in America for the past 20, 30 years has deconstructed that ability for blacks and whites, or whites and blacks, however you'd like to say it. You know, it's interesting to me after civil rights, and it when it didn't create this deconstructive element, then you have this really big push for migration, right? After whites and blacks didn't go to war openly in the streets, you know, in a mass way, well, then you had these cosmopolitans, these elitists, these globalist elites, right? They really started working on, well, shit. Let's get shoot. Let's get another group in here. If the whites and the blacks aren't going to fight because there aren't enough blacks, or then and the whites are still so dominant, let's see if we can't get another group in here to mess it up. And so then you see the Mexicans, the Hispanics, the Central Americans start to flood in legally and illegally. And now you start displacing the blacks, who are now starting to try to, you know, after years and years and years, they're like, you know what? Maybe these Europeans have something, right? Like, God, you know, they start like, shit, do we really want to go back to Africa? What's there? Nothing. Nothing. And so they're like, you know what? No, let's stay. Let's stay and be a part of America. But you can't have that. You can't have a group of people fundamentally believe that the Europeans are right, that self-determinism, that responsible parenting, that nuclear family life, that extended family life is correct, is beneficial, that Western society and ideals are beneficial. So what do? You bring in another group, and now you've displaced the group that is trying to lift themselves out of poverty. And now you get to another point where it's like, well, who's the fault here? Well, it's the white people still. Still, it's them because they're still the majority. But realistically, everything was fine before. So who got displaced? It was your poor whites, your unskilled whites, and black Americans at large. Somehow whites got blamed again, and it wasn't whites, right? Like they didn't decide to displace themselves. So who did it? Again, I keep going back to it. We need to start really asking these really hard questions of ourselves. How did we get to this point? Who brought the Mexicans in? Was it the whites? No, of course not. So who was it? Why?
I've been thinking a lot, maybe not recently, but this year, about the impact of civil rights. And sort of like the world in the 1950s, just prior to civil rights, right? And you had what was truly, like actually, a predominantly conservative black population. And civil rights came along, and there were benefits from it, of course. The equal representation of blacks. That was, I would argue a net good. But afterward, what has ended up happening is the racial divide has in fact grown way larger than it ever was pre-civil rights. The destruction of the black family is a big thing that we can point to, and where it started. It goes into things like naming, the names of black children, the post-civil rights, the names of black children changed drastically. They became very Islamic and sort of unique in sort of naming conventions. The divide has grown significantly larger. And it's interesting to me, and it's something that I think about kind of frequently. Like, was this a net good? Because here's the reality. When America was founded, America was monoracial, right? It was the WASPs, as you say. White, European Christians, right? And not long after is when a lot of people started getting slaves sold by Africans, to Americans and Europeans in general. It was not exclusively an American thing. And holy cow, okay. Whew, man, what a crazy idea here. So, let's just, I don't remember exactly when the slave trade started into America, but it was, America had existed for a little while. And ever since then, America has been predominantly a biracial country. And if you look at the population trends, this is where it gets really interesting. If you look at the population trends, they have been practically identical since the inception of America. I mean, literally, like, all the way back. I mean, take the time, research it yourself, all the way back to antiquity, right? 200 years ago. It's been like 85% white, 12% black, and like 3% other, right? Oh my God. All the way, even today, the population ratio has remained the same. And what ended up happening in like the 1950s is like, after all this time, we kind of started to, I wouldn't say get along. I would say that, be a mischaracterization. But in many ways, we started kind of like recognizing, right? Like, hey, we kind of can make this work, right? If you guys kind of adopt our values, like, we can kind of make this work. We're still we're still the majority. We're still 85%. We can kind of make this work. And civil rights came along and said, hey, things aren't where we want them to be. We want to not be discriminated against. We don't want to drink from different fountains than you and sit in the back of the bus. And white people were like, you know what? Hey, we did wrong. Okay, sorry about that. And then, like you said, 1965 happened, right? 1965 hits. And the Hart-Celler Act gets passed. And all of a sudden, this sort of tacit agreement between whites and blacks was demolished by the introduction of enormous numbers of Latin American immigrants. Everything we worked for 200 years was overnight demolished. I struggle to come up with the rationalization that was a good thing, because again, there are metrics by which you can measure the damage to the black community, strictly the black community. You know, family values is a big one, right? Back in the 1950s and in the 1940s and even further back, everybody kind of kept to their own people, right? It was blacks married blacks, whites married whites. There was some rare admixture, but by and large, it was everybody kept to their own people. And I don't know. I can't think anymore that it was a good thing, that the destruction of the family unit was a good thing, because I truly believe that the best metric for life outcome is the importance of a nuclear family, right? Is having a mother and a father, not just a dad, not just a mom, but both together. And that used to be the values that black families held. In post-civil rights, that's not the case.
Well, what's really interesting to me is that if you look at the Hart-Celler Act, right, one of the guys who was a real proponent of this and that authored the act and was a major sponsor of that legislation, he did so out of, and this is by his own admission, sort of a revenge, right? Like, he wanted to make sure that his group, he was an Eastern European Jew, never ever was excluded again, right? And he stated that this won't change the demographics of the United States, it never will. And everyone that promoted the bill said that it won't, you're silly, don't be ridiculous. But he stated, if you look at his own statements, he said that it was out of revenge for the United States not taking in more Jews during the 30s and the 20s. Because he said that would have prevented, in his own words, right, the Holocaust, quote unquote. So why do we still suffer today? Not only for something that we, had no part in, but fought against as a nation. Why are we still victimized because of something we never did? And look at Black America. They're suffering disproportionately more. I think that, it's time we really look at what's going on and why. I just, it's not a feeling, it's not a thought, it's a fact. We've got to do something to really change course as a nation. Otherwise, we're all going to really suffer.
We really are. To really ram the point home, I feel like pre-civil rights, pre-Hart-Celler, we had, well, not pre-civil rights, during the civil rights, right? As despicable a human being as Martin Luther King Jr. was, with his sort of sexual impropriety and promiscuousness and his plagiarism and all these other things, the ideas that he said were distinctly American, right? distinctly. Nobody, not even the most sort of die-hard ethno-nationalist, can even disagree with that. His ideas, things that he said in his speeches, were distinctly American. So, even like taking into consideration the benefits for the black community of civil rights, if you let's just say pre-Hart-Celler, right? Pre-1965 Hart-Celler, we finally reached like a racial harmoniousness, right? Finally, after all these years, it was finally reached. Like we said, no longer will there be any discrimination legally allowed. There are laws now in place that completely eliminate the possibility for any racial discrimination. And then Hart-Celler hit. And, it was slow at first. It was slow. But it wasn't long after. Like, by 1975, they knew, right? The government knew, like, this is bringing in a lot of Latin American people, right? And all that racial harmoniousness went away. Now, that isn't to say, I don't want to sound like some sort of apologist for all the issues that come with black crime and the differences in black culture. There's no question in my mind that we have a very different culture. Certainly today, I think that has that divide has grown significantly today. Again, I think I've talked about this before. It goes back to things like even the cigarettes we smoke, the cars we drive, the names that we give to our children, so on and so forth. I mean, of course, there is a significant cultural and racial divide today. But I feel like back in like the 1950s, that wasn't so much the case. Like, the names that these people were getting, it was, the most popular name back then was very different than it is today. The most popular name today, I think, is still DeAndre. Just, I don't know. My thoughts are getting kind of scrambled, but the point remains, I think we had really, really reached a racial harmony between the two and a sort of agreement, a sort of unspoken agreement that, like, hey, look, you guys are the minority and you're going to kind of remain the minority, but that's okay. We promise we're not going to anymore discriminate against you unfairly. Which is, I mean, it doesn't get more white than that, right? Like, hey, look, we promise. It's this idea. Oh, God, if it wasn't like 5 a.m, I could remember who came up with the idea. The sort of idea that you have a moral obligation to your slave. It goes back to Greece.
Yeah, it was a very big Roman thing, right? Like, the idea was that you took care of your slave, not because you necessarily cared about your slave, but because it was the right thing to do. Um, and even in the United States, right? Like, we very much demonize Confederates and the Southern states, but realistically, a slave owner was only going to be so brutal to a slave because if they harmed the slave, then the output would go down, right? So, you know, this idea that we lived in this society where we were very brutal or that we were ever very harsh, the only people we were ever very harsh to were ourselves. And yes, we did live in a society in the United States where before blacks were disadvantaged towards whites, right? And it just was. But we allowed them to live in their own communities and have self determinism before civil rights as it was practiced after desegregation. I mean, imagine that. There were places in my state where blacks did not want to reintegrate. They, they enjoyed their schools. They thought that they would do better, and ultimately were proven to be correct in that assumption. What if they just learned differently, right? What if they learn differently and they have black teachers and they learn better from black teachers than they would from white? What sort of disservice are we doing to them to force them into our schools? And then by the same token, what sort of disservice are we doing to our students, our people, if we force them into curriculums and classes with students who don't learn the same way as them? Those are questions we never really asked, and we never really did any studies. We just said, nope, this is the right way. This is the right way. But who's saying that?
More and more, we are seeing, actually, that we do learn differently. I was listening to I don't want to call it a podcast. It's like little 15-minute segments of philosophy where they have important people come on and talk about different things. It was on African philosophy, and it was talking about how in Africa, the philosophers there view the world very, very differently. And consider for a moment, right? Consider for a moment that America has only been around for, 250 years or so. That's it. That's not enough time that's not enough time for anything. I mean, anything at all. It's the way that African people view the world is very different. But I say again, we had reached at least a modicum, an iota of racial harmony by saying, all right, hey guys, you have your black schools, we have our white schools, we have, and yeah, did it go too far? Sure it did. Okay, of course. People shouldn't be, I guess, compelled to drink from a different drinking fountain and things like that. I mean, now you're reaching a little bit too far, I think. But this integration, this forced integration, right? Do you remember the pictures? My God, they literally had these people escorted by armed police, right? It was by threat of force. You will have a black student or else. Oh my God. Like, what happened to the idea of free market of, freedom of association? What happened to that idea? Like, okay, to say like, hey, look, there will be no law that permits a discrimination based on race. Okay, sure, yep, great, support that. But you should at least, be able to on a simple level say like, hey, look, you guys do your thing, we'll do ours. It's an equal but separate idea, right? I mean, I don't know, man. I think we've gone on plenty long, and it's now 5 a.m. and this is a two-parter, but we have a whole heck of a lot more to talk about, Western One. You and I think, see eye to eye on a lot of issues, and we have a very similar upbringing. So I look forward to having you on in the future, and thank you for spending 3 hours talking about these things with me. But thank you also to any viewers, and thank you for tolerating my slightly intoxicated ramblings. It's not often I get the opportunity to drink, but it is my birthday, so I'm gonna spoil myself just a little bit. So thank you again to everybody, and we will see you next time.